Hey everybody, this is Kennedy Hawk from the MCM team. For today's Tactical Thursday, we're going to do an Ebony Maw strategy guide. So if you haven't purchased or played Mad Titan Shadow yet, stop this video right now, just click pause, don't even finish this sentence, go play Ebony Maw, come back and watch this video and tell me how wrong I am about my overview of Ebony Maw, ways to defeat him, and ways that he can just be an absolute pain in the butt. So there's your spoiler warning. With that, we're going to move right on. So what's the hook with Ebony Maw? I always like to talk about what makes a scenario unique. You're buying all these scenarios and you need a reason to bring each one to the table. Ebony Maw does have an interesting hook. His interesting hook is all about delayed effects. You can read right in here, Ebony Maw number 1, forced interrupt. When Ebony Maw activates against you, remove an invocation counter from each spell card in your play area. That's interesting. And then here's an example of a spell card, Manipulation, Surge, ignore that for now, but enters play with 2 invocation counters on it. After the last counter is removed, discard it, then discard 1 card at random from your hand, and you are confused. So he's going to have a ton of spells that are environment cards that can go out into the board. They all have delayed effects, and he'll slowly progress towards casting them or completing these invocations or spells or whatever you want to call them as he activates against you. So you're going to have this forward knowledge as a player, which arms you in a different way than you have in any other scenario. So that is pretty cool, and I appreciate that new design take. So let's get right into it and look at the villain cards here. Here we have Ebony Maw 1, 2, and 3. So 1 and 2 for standard mode, 2 and 3 for expert. The Black Order and Mystic trait, you can see from 1 to 2, he gains 1 attack, and then from 2 to 3, he gains 1 scheme. So he is a schemer more than an attacker. But don't worry, there's enough damage going on that you will get to recover. He's got that same ability on each of his forms, the Forced Interrupt that has you remove an invocation, but version 2 and version 3 also has a when revealed effect. Each player discards cards from the top of the encounter deck until they discard a spell and puts that card into play in their spell area. So putting it into play is going to avoid the surge, which is nice. But this happens to each player. So if you're starting in expert mode, you're starting with 4 spells out in multiplayer, which is a lot. And we'll see that you might start with even more than that. So you need to be a little bit careful about when you progress from stage 1 to stage 2, because something bad comes out when you do it. You might want to do it when the deck is close to being empty, or you might want to do it when you know there's easier spells in there. Just another lever that the players can play with to try to beat and conquer Ebony Maw. So let's look at his main scheme, Attack on Nowhere. We're going to include Ebony Maw, the standard and counter sets, and 2 modular sets. I love things that have 2 modular sets. I feel like Ebony has enough things in his encounter deck that he still feels unique even with 2 encounter sets, and having 2 mod sets just gives you so many more fun combinations you can do and try out that I love it. We're not going to go over those modular sets today. Those will happen on Modular Mondays, but you do include 2 modular sets and the standard set, so don't forget that. But you can see right here in 1B, we have another when revealed. Each player discards cards from the top of the encounter deck until a spell environment is discarded. Then shuffle the encounter deck discard pile back into the encounter deck. Now there's a big debate in the community about what happens first. Do you do the villains when revealed first or the schemes when revealed first? Because one of them has you shuffle things back in and one doesn't in expert mode. Just do it the way that's more fun to you. If you want to start with cards in the discard pile, then do Attack on Nowhere and then Ebony Maw 2. If you want to do it the opposite way, then do it the opposite way. Totally fine. What you should note here is that in expert mode, in 4 players, you're now starting with 2 spells per player. That's a lot of encounter cards out on the board with him ready to cast them, and it can be daunting. If we look at 2A here, we shuffle the encounter deck discard pile back into the encounter deck, and each player discards cards and finds a spell again. We start with 1 threat per player in both schemes, and they only go up by 1 per player, so no more of that nastiness from Galaxy's Most Wanted. 6 threat per player on Attack on Nowhere is actually pretty low. Like, that can pop sometimes if he schemes really hard with his 3 scheme in stage 3. And you really have to be careful with when you let that pop. Just like when you push the villain to the next level, there's going to be this nasty effect that comes, so you have to be prepared. Thankfully, this 9 threat per player on 2B is very generous, so I haven't seen a lot of games lose due to threading because that value is so high, especially once you get to 2+ players. Alright, so we know the main schemes, we know the villain. Let's look at these spell environment cards. So there are 8 spell environment cards, so let's stop and just talk there right away. In expert mode, you're starting with 8 spells in play. There's only 8 in the deck. So anything that goes and searches for a spell, like in your first encounter phase or your second encounter phase, is really bad, because if these haven't exploded yet, there's no spells for it to find. That's terrifying and a little bit annoying, but regardless, there's 8 of these spell environments. There's 2 copies of each, so there's Fireball. This enters play with 4 invocation counters, and luckily it gives you a lot of time to deal with it, because it's going to deal 4 damage to your identity when the last counter is removed. We've got Rumble Storm, or Rubble Storm. We call this Rubble Rubble, like the hamburger stealing guy from McDonald's. But anyway, Surge enters play with 3 counters. This is going to do 2 AoE damage to each character you control, so that's all your allies and your hero / alter ego. So there's 12 points of damage each pass through the deck right there between the 2 Fireballs and 2 Rumble Storms. We've got 2 copies of Manipulation. This enters with only 2 invocation counters, and when it completes, you discard 1 card at random from your hand, and you are confused. And then we have Pacification, which enters with 3. You're going to exhaust each upgrade you control, and you are stunned. So he's got stunned and confused in his spells, and a ton of damage. Not any threat placement, though, so he's really relying on his scheming to place threat and some of his treachery cards. So remember, all of these are going to remove an invocation counter every time he activates. So any way you can cancel activations is going to be really good at delaying these delayed effects. You also have to pay attention to how they're all lining up. Let's say you start the game in expert mode with 2 Fireballs. Well, now you know you're taking 8 damage after 4 activations. And if your first encounter star card is a Rubble Storm after he's activated once, now you've got 10 damage coming at face all at the same time, because those 4s and 3s line up. Ideally, you kind of want these to be dissimilar, where you have different amounts of invocation counters on all your spells, so that you're not having like 6 things happen at once. And note, this is a forced interrupt when he activates against you, so this happens before Ebony Maw completes his attack. So if Ebony Maw 2 is attacking you and you get hit with a Fireball, you get hit for 4, then he attacks you with a boost card, which is going to hit you for even more damage. So you got to be really careful with paying attention to when these spells are going to go off, and make sure you're in the right form to deal with whatever is going to happen. Note that Rubble Storm and Fireball still damage you in alter ego form, so you can flip down, the villain can scheme, but you're not safe. But not flipping down and taking an attack and a Fireball is probably a little bit more dangerous, so sometimes you just need to do that. Alright, we've got 5 Treachery Cards. Note, he has no extra activation cards, which is actually really good, because if he had extra activation cards on top of the standard ones, he'd be removing spells like crazy. So we've got 2 copies of Agent of Thanos. Place 1 threat in the main scheme for each spell environment in your play area. If there are no threats added this way, gain Surge. And then the when revealed hero is the same thing but damage. So this is just your play area, so cards that are attached to you, not spells that are cast on other players. Either way, this can be really annoying, especially in solo if you get the 3 to 4 spells out because of a surge chain, and this comes up and it deals 4 damage to you, and then you know next turn a Fireball's hitting you in the face. Really, really nasty. We've got 3 copies of Channeling Trance. Remove 1 invocation counter from each spell. So this is kind of like an activation, but not. It's a little bit easier, right? So if this had just been a Ebony Maw attacks you, you would have removed one of those counters anyway, and then he would have attacked you, so it would have been really bad. This one is just remove one counter from each spell. If you have no spell environments in your play area, discard cards from the top of the encounter deck until a spell environment is discarded. So these resolve in order, is my understanding, sentence by sentence. You remove 1 invocation counter from each spell environment in your play area. If that removes the last spell from play, you go to the next sentence. If you have no spells in your play area, you don't. You're going to go get a new one. So the worst time this can happen is when it's your last spell that's in play, or the last spell you have in play has 1 counter on it, because he's going to trigger that spell and then go find another one and put it into your play area, which can be really annoying. And note, you're discarding cards here, so if you're playing in a multiplayer game, maybe a 4-player game, and everybody else has 2 to 3 spells on them and there's none left in the deck, and you have none on you, if you draw Channeling Trance, you can easily burn through the entire encounter deck and just get an acceleration token. So in a way, it's almost nice to have a spell on you, but it's also horrible because this thing can hit you really, really hard. Alright, then we got the other stuff. I'm a bit disappointed in the other stuff that happens here. None of these interact with his spells at all. Everything else has been a really tight design based around these spells and the number of spells you have. We've got 2 attachments. 1 attaches to Ebony Maw. It prevents all damage. After it prevents 2 or more damage from a single attack, you discard it. And then we've got another one that attaches to the highest attack friendly character and exhausts it. That character cannot ready. until you take a hero action to discard it. I mean, these are helpful cards for Ebony Maw, don't get me wrong. They just don't trigger into his ability, which is a bit disappointing. We've got 2 copies of Reactor Overload. So Maw's troops have stormed Nowhere's engine room and set the station to overload. That's like a setting on the station. You just turn this knob till it says overload and like alarms start going off and electricity starts flying around. When revealed, each player must choose to either take 2 damage or place 2 threat here. So we've had that effect many times before. It's got a crisis icon. It's pretty generic. The worst thing about it is it has 3 boost icons and there's 2 of them in the deck. So he does have some side schemes. Again, nothing to interact with his spells, which is a bit disappointing. I really would have loved these cards fully fleshed out Ebony Maw's design. Alright, so some takeaways. He's got 17 cards in his deck outside of his main schemes and his villain forms. 12 of those cards, if we look through these, have 2 or more boost icons. You've got the 8 spells, you've got the 2 reactor overloads, and then you've got these 2 attachments. The only things that don't are these treachery cards, and those have 1. So he's got no 0 boost icon cards in his original kit. So depending on what modules you mix in, he can have a really high boost icon count. Luckily, a lot of those 2 boost icon cards are on these spells that are going to sit and play for longer, be less likely to be shuffled back into the deck. But still, if you're playing in solo that first time through your deck, when these come up as treachery cards or as boost cards, they don't feel necessarily like a break. They don't come into play like Nebula. Nebula's kind of had that delete effect thing going before, but Nebula's delete effect is kind of immediate and overbearing and constant. Ebony Maw doesn't feel that way outside of a few situations, so that's really good. While he is the first villain, he's also one of the swingiest, which can lead to some real feel-bad moments. I mentioned earlier having double fireball, or not having any spells for triggering things in multiplayer, like when you're searching through the deck for spells and you don't find any, you just dump a bunch of acceleration tokens onto the main scheme. And those are just some fail-safes that didn't either get accounted for in the design, or they were accounted for and they're meant to be challenging. It can lead to him being really swingy. He's not swingy in the way Nebula is, but you can definitely walk into games where there's just no winning outside of you running some obscure card that gives you toughness. And you can also run into games where Ebony Maw does nothing but sits around the entire game where you punch him like a punching bag, which those are not my favorite scenarios. I like scenarios that have a consistent difficulty level and they have spikes within their difficulty level, within the game, but aren't super spiky or super easy. Those are just too polarizing for me. So those are some takeaways, but let's talk about 5 tips to help you beat Ebony Maw. So against Ebony Maw, status cards are still strong. Anything you can do to eliminate activations is going to prolong how long those spells sit out there. And this is a double-edged sword in lower player counts, because if you stun him for a couple turns and get some more spells as your encounter card for that round, you might end up with 5 spells on the board. And then when the turn comes that you can't stun him, and he double attacks you for some reason, all those spells go off at the same time. But as long as you keep stunning or confusing him or trading who he activates against, you're going to have a pretty good time. So look for things that cancel that activation. Those are really, really, really important. Don't forget about the standard extra activation cards. I know I mentioned there were none in his kit, but drawing an assault or drawing an advance when you have 1 token left on a bunch of spells can just be game ending. So be prepared for that. Alright, tip number 2. Everyone needs endurance. Just take your 4-player campaign, build 39 card decks, and then put endurance in there. And just let it be known, I am the biggest not fan of recovering and defending. There's a reason I hate protection cards, and I don't like flipping down to recover. But you kind of need to in this scenario. It's really easy. The very first time I played this scenario, and maybe that's why I have such a Debbie Downer opinion about it, was I was playing as Hawkeye in expert mode, and I got double fireballed. Ebony Maw activated against me once, but I blocked with an ally, so those both went down to 3 counters, and then my very first encounter card was Rebel Storm. So I now had 3 spells with 3 counters on them, and I was going to take 10 damage to face. So the first game I played, I had endurance in my deck, but I wasn't able to dig through it fast enough to find it, and when it came time for those spells to explode, I took 10 unavoidable damage. Nothing I can do with allies to block it, I just need toughness or extra hit points. So low HP characters, they really need an out for when things like this happen. And it's not just like this craziness that's double Fireball plus Rumble Storm. Remember, he's still attacking you and dealing damage to you while he removes those counters. So even if you're at like 6 health because you took one attack as Hawkeye and went from 9 to 6, now you just need a Fireball and one Rumble Storm. And that's a lot easier to have happen. So there's going to be a lot of damage coming out. Since Endurance can be played on any player, what I recommend in multiplayer games is whenever somebody draws it, you play it on the player who's in the most dire need. Usually the player that has the most spells in front of them. Because you can pass it around, and when somebody else draws it, they can play it on you later, but you're keeping that player alive, which is really, really important. Alright, next, be prepared to flip. Maw doesn't hit hard, right? He has low attack, but those fireballs, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. Being hit by a double fireball is just not fun. There's nothing you can do about it. There's very little damage prevention for non-attacks. You can use defense cards against it now, so if you have a hero that happens to have one of those damage-avoiding cards, that can be really nice. And maybe this is one of those niche scenarios where like people run warning or something really, really bad in normal scenarios. But it's really easy to get spiked for a ton of damage. So you need to be flipping and keeping yourself at as much HP as you can, and you need to bring a versatile deck to do that. You need to have healing and economy and damage to counter whatever spells come out on you, because all these spells have different effects, and they're all going to ruin your deck in different ways. So the best thing you can do is bring things that counter each of those. There's the ones that discards random cards, so bringing some mansions, some card draw is going to be helpful. Obviously bringing healing is going to be helpful, things like that. Be prepared to take damage in Alter Ego mode. I mentioned this before, Fireball and Rebel Storm will hit you in Alter Ego mode. So flipping to Alter Ego mode does not make you safe like it does in most scenarios. But you're going to want to be able to flip. So Confuse, again, status conditions, these are all kind of the same hint over and over again. Just play all your good cards and win, right? But that's basically the story here. Alright, be careful with progress. I've had multiple people tell me about this, and I've had it happen to me at least once. You don't want to flip Maw or let his scheme flip at the wrong moment. In Expert mode, in 4-player, you're starting with all 8 of those spells out in play. So if you somehow, before those spells disappear, just pummel through Maw, and he gets pushed to stage 3, each player has to, in player order, discard cards from the top of the encounter deck until they discard a spell. If there's no spells in the encounter deck or discard pile because they're all in play, that means you're getting 4 acceleration tokens. Nobody wants to deal with 4 acceleration tokens, or shuffle the deck 4 times hoping that they find a spell. You can probably look through it and see that there's not one. And this doesn't have to happen only at the beginning of the game. I found it's a lot more common in 2 to 3 players, where you might like surge into a bunch of spells round 1, and then round 2 you bum rush them down, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I just got a bunch of accelerations, and it's not a feel-good moment. Usually when that happens, you go from stage 2 to stage 3, you get a bunch of acceleration tokens that pushes stage 1B into 2A, and you again get another bunch of acceleration tokens, and it snowballs into a defeat. So be really careful with when you trigger these abilities. These are, for the most part, abilities you can control. You decide when to go into Ebony Maw 2 or into Ebony Maw 3. So do that when it makes the most sense, when you know, hey, maybe there's only 2 cards left in the encounter deck, so I'm going to get an acceleration token anyway, but I can avoid a spell. Or maybe you do it right after the encounter deck shuffles in, because you know there's likely to be a spell in there and you're not going to get a ton of acceleration tokens placed. So just be careful with when you progress the villain or the scheme. Alright, we're going to end as we always do with some key counter cards and then some thoughts on the scenario. So again, status conditions, status conditions, status conditions. I told you to tell everybody to bring Endurance. I'm going to tell you to tell everybody to bring Mockingbird. There's no reason not to. Mockingbird, Mockingbird, Mockingbird. Get those stuns out there. Use Tackle, Concussive Blow, Sonic Rifle, Dropkick, whatever you can to place a status condition. It is going to help you. Webbed Up is actually really good in multiplayer because you can avoid 2 activations, which you can't stack double stuns on if both people want to sit in hero form. So Webbed Up can be really powerful in this scenario. Generally things that like block the villain attack by reducing the damage to 0, like Backflip and Shield Block, not as good because he's still getting damage out from his spells, but still better than just taking damage to the face. So status conditions. Alright, I already mentioned it, Endurance, but just some other niche stuff. You're going to want to bring Black Widow if you're a protection player. You can cancel cards that just end your day, right? You can cancel a spell when it comes out if it's going to end your day, and that'll cancel the Surge too, which sounds great because you're not just canceling the when revealed effects, you're canceling all the effects on the card. It's going to Surge anyway because Black Widow is going to deal you something new, but at least you weren't going to get a spell and something new, so it's a little bit better. Bring Espionage. All 8 of those spell environments have Surge. Things are going to surge when you play against Ebony Maw. So bring Espionage if you have a spy character, or if you're running Black Widow or Mockingbird, you probably have a spy character in your deck. That extra card draw is going to help you burst him down faster. Alright, those were all my slides. Just my final thoughts on Ebony Maw. Comparing him to the other first 2 villains from the campaign boxes, he's definitely my least favorite intro villain. All of the villains in the box, he's one of my least favorite, mainly due to his swinginess. I feel like there's a lot of really good designed villains in this box, so maybe saying he's one of my least favorite isn't saying very much. He can still be really fun, and he offers this new decision point of, I know what things are coming up, how do I prepare for that thing and still progress to my win condition? The main advice I would give you is early on, focus on just maintaining the board until you deal with those initial spells that come out, and then later on focus on like burning the villain down now that the board is a little bit more under control. I really don't like his swinginess, but I also know that there's a lot of players that do like that swinginess where things can just like surge out of control, or the villain can just fall flat on their face, because that can be very comical too. Ultimately, he's an intro villain. We should expect him to act like an intro villain. He should be pretty easy to win. He is pretty easy to win unless you end up in one of those just NPE situations. So, if you have MTS and you've played Ebony Maw, put your hints for the community and strategy tips for people on how to tackle this villain in the comments below. And the next 4 weeks, we'll be going after one villain each week on our Technical Thursday videos. Thanks for tuning in, and see everybody on Friday.